the fact that the United States and NATO countries treat Ukraine like a neo-colony by asserting domination over its political life. And that's what's happening right now with this internal instability. That's always been the case since 2014, since this coup, that there has been an egregious amount of power that the U.S. and its allies, its NATO allies, have over how Ukraine administers itself politically. And so what happens when certain political forces within a neo-colony begin to be inconvenient, begin to be disruptive, and it's not that Zelensky is anti-establishment or that he's working against U.S. interests directly. He's not going against the NATO agenda for Russia or anything else. But even poor behavior, right? Even ineffective leadership, even just making certain decisions, bad public relations, right? Not having the ability to maintain any semblance of even an illusory stability. That can also get you on the chopping block, because it's the United States and NATO that actually has the control here. So as the war becomes less favorable for Ukraine as this neo-colony, the more that the United States is going to assert its dominance politically, so that whoever is in charge in Ukraine does what the United States and does what NATO wants at the end of the day, not make these ridiculous mistakes, not try to get bigger than try to act bigger than you really are, or to assert more influence than you really have, not to get into public relations nightmares, which Zelensky has walked into over and over and over again. Don't go to Congress and try to embarrass Joe Biden. Like these kind of moves make Zelensky a bit of a handful at this moment. And it's a monster, of course, of the U.S. and NATO's own making. But nonetheless, the United States and NATO are going to want to control this monster. So let's hear what the Duran has to say. Let's play a little bit of this. They talk about these purges, and I skip over them covering the details of it because we went over that in the article. I want to play their analysis. So let's tune in to what Alexander Mercouris has to say about it, because I find it very interesting, the analysis and the analogy that he makes about this internal turmoil. Here we go.
And then just after all of that, we have announcements of this massive purge. And if you're absolutely right, it extends right through every single layer and level of the Ukrainian government, all the way up to Zelensky's own office. Government ministers are involved. The defense minister, Reznikov, has been implicated in some way, but apparently he's going to remain, one senses, because the Americans back him, but all sorts of other people are being sacked and fired all over the place, right across Ukraine. And Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council is now issuing orders that these people are not allowed to leave Ukraine as well. So something is going on here. And we got reports over the last few days that about a week ago, the director of the CIA, William Burns, went to Kiev. And inevitably, people are linking Burns's visit to Kiev with this huge purge. And I have to say, I think that's completely plausible. I would be very surprised if the Ukrainian leadership were to carry out a purge of this kind without first having it cleared it with the Americans. But beyond that, I do wonder whether the initiative for this might in fact not have come from the Americans. In other words, that Burns is now came along, gave Zelensky instructions. He said, we want all of these people out. We want our own people in. And this is what we're seeing. One way or the other, whatever explanation there is for all these moves, and I'm not saying that all of them are connected to each other. Maybe Aristovich's resignation was completely, unconnected to this. Maybe the helicopter crash was just an accident. I don't know. But one way or the other, it does suggest growing instability in Kiev.
So that CIA point I want to reinforce, because the CIA doesn't just come to your doorstep. Doesn't come to your government office and say nothing to you. The CIA is the one that gives orders. Do you know what I'm saying? You have to understand that the CIA doesn't go to follow orders. It doesn't go to collaborate. It goes to give orders. And that's what it did to Ukraine's government. You'll never find this out until there's some kind of leaked information. But if William Burns is showing up at your doorstep and says, we want a meeting, I'm going to travel thousands of miles away, to you. I'm going to head to Kiev. I'm going to sit in an office with you. You better believe that you're getting directives. You are not giving directives. Do you know what I'm saying? That's what happened. And I think there's no doubt that this visit from William Burns is directly connected to the turmoil we're seeing, because that turmoil is a reflection of dissatisfaction. And why wouldn't the United States be dissatisfied? Zelensky has honestly done a lot of things that have been embarrassing. And his leadership, honestly, the leadership around him too, is largely ineffective. Look at what happened to the weapons. Look at how this war has been fought. Look at how many people have died. Look at how, just look at it. I mean, it's a monster of the US and NATO's creation, but look at what has transpired. There has been a stagnation for Ukraine for 6+ months now, and so many people lost. And the most important thing is that the United States has lost so much of its weaponry to Ukraine. It has fortified it with nothing to show for it. So the CIA, which has been in Ukraine for quite some time, since at least 2015, arming, training these rebel forces, these insurgent forces, really these nationalist, fascist forces in Ukraine. The CIA is very unhappy with the way things are going. And so politically, obviously, a huge part of this is about making changes so the U.S. can reassert its neo-colonial control over Ukraine. Let's continue.
And I've discussed in the past how, in the early 60s in Saigon, as the Americans got more and more involved, we saw some signs of instability there, eventually leading to a coup against the president of the country, President Diem. It's beginning to have a look, something of that feel about this in Ukraine now. A purge, massive purge, I think purge is not the wrong word, of the entire military, political structure, or security structure of Ukraine going on in the middle of a war, when the news of the battlefields is turning bad, and when the Americans are incredibly heavily involved. As I said, something is going on, something big is clearly going on, and it suggests growing instability in Kiev.
So, yes, growing instability in Kiev is correct. And, I think that one of the things that we have to consider is that this instability is being fostered by is first of all a product of the war. It's a product of the fact that Ukraine is unraveling because it is not winning, it's losing, and it really is showing probably great divisions internally. We see that already with what happened to Arestovich. Arestovich kind of planted a kind of a political ideological bomb. He made a 180 and started going after Zelensky and going after the regime. That was a political 180 for him, but he did it because the writing was on the wall and he wanted to get out. And so Ukraine, Zelensky said, "Oh, we're going to force you out. You're not going to be able to get out on your own. We're going to force you out." And then you had the interior minister, of course, die in that helicopter crash. And now you have this wave of purges happening internally, and it's all to reorient and redirect. Maybe they're not connected, as Alexander said. We can't exactly be sure, but it's possible that these purges are connected in the sense that it is about a political realignment and preparing Ukraine for U.S. political control, for U.S. in NATO domination, moving forward in a time of great sensitivity where a lot is on the line. So let's continue a little longer.
Yeah, the excuse that they gave for Burns's trip to meet with Zelensky was that he wanted to brief Zelensky on Russia's next military moves, which is absolutely ridiculous. The CIA director travels to Kiev so that he can brief Zelensky on Russia's next moves.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's nonsense. I mean, if you believe that we have not just a bridge to sell you, but many bridges. I mean, it's just not plausible.
Okay, so the question is.
So I'll leave it there because I want to show you, right? I want to show you. I think that is enough. The Vietnam connection is interesting because during the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, indeed, the South fell because the puppet, President Diem at the time, was supposed to be the the U.S. chosen president of all of Vietnam, but only held the U.S. occupied South, wholly unpopular. And as the military situation unraveled, as the guerrillas, as the peasants, and this kind of ragtag insurgent force led by communists, but also it was really a national liberation movement, right? You had this, basically, you had the whole of the impoverished peasantry rise up and essentially threaten the U.S. occupation and the Western-backed occupation. As that began to transpire, and as things like the TED, as things started to get more and more intense and look really bad for the puppet regime, well, then Diem was assassinated, right? He was taken out. And that was because the United States needed new political blood. They needed a puppet that would be better. But of course, you know what happened in Vietnam. The United States didn't really have a chance to establish any kind of political control because the United States was kicked out of Vietnam. Now, the war is a little bit different when it comes to Ukraine. I don't see the U.S. and NATO necessarily being kicked out because it's being waged in a different manner. But I do see this purge along the lines of how the United States treats neo-colonies, how NATO wants to establish a neo-colony here, a buffer to continue its onslaught and its aggression toward Russia. And really any movement, any national attempt, any attempt by a country to assert self-determination, because Vietnam was about that. Vietnam was trying to assert self-determination. It was fighting against the forced division that was enforced by the United States. Of course, the Soviet Union participated in it because of the Cold War, but the United States really didn't want to see a fully communist-led government. And so the United States said, no, we're not going to lose Vietnam to communism because we lost China to communism. We lost the Soviet Union to communism. We're going to wage a full-scale war. And that full-scale war ended up with political turmoil for its puppets eventually. And now we have a proxy war that's doing the same thing to Zelensky. And this has happened everywhere that the United States has attempted to administer political control through neocolonialism. It's happened in Latin America. We've seen the leftist movements rise up and kind of kick out a lot of these U.S. puppets. The CIA kidnapped Hugo Chavez in 2004 during the coup. And we've seen still coup after coup after coup attempts to reestablish political control, coup attempts in Venezuela, coups in Brazil. You've seen it over and over again in Latin America. Africa, the African continent, has arguably been even more unstable. Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his book, I believe it was Class Struggle in Africa, where the African continent at one point during the tumultuous 1950s to 1960s period where there were independence movements, there were countries fighting for independence nonviolently. Some of them were taking up arms to do so. Some of them were being backed by socialist governments, Soviet Union, China. But there was a massive wave of independence sweeping across the African continent. And what happened? Well, the United States came in as this new imperial hegemon and said, no, we're going to establish political control. And that led to, I believe Nkrumah said something like hundreds of coups across the African continent through its 50 plus countries over that span. So much political turmoil, so much attempts to get military control in these countries, trying to get political control in order to enforce economic control. And so I believe that a huge reason why this is happening, a huge reason why there are these purges in Ukraine's government is because the United States has a lot of investments coming through the IMF. And Zelensky has made has made his position as a neo-colonialist, as a puppet of the West, quite clear. He's tried to be as just incredibly subservient to the West as he could. Listen to this. Michael Tracy posted this on Twitter. This is how Zelensky has talked about his political rule and how he's talked about what the Ukraine conflict and what waging a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine can do. He said in addressing a Chamber of Commerce meeting in Boca Raton, Zelensky thanked BlackRock, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs for their support and said that heavier weapons like Abrams tanks represent a huge business opportunity. Let's listen to what he had to say. But this shows how indebted he already, back in, I believe it was September of last year, if not earlier than that, he went to Wall Street and said, Ukraine is open for business. Here is another iteration of that, which to me is even more groveling than even that. So here we go.
It is obvious that American business can become the locomotive that will once again push forward global economic growth. We have already managed to attract attention and have cooperation with such giants of the international financial and investment world as BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. Such American brands as Starlink or Westinghouse have already become part of our Ukrainian way. Your brilliant defense systems, such as HIMARS or Bradleys, are already uniting our history of freedom with your enterprises. We are waiting for Patriots. We are looking closely at Abrams. Thousands of such examples are possible, and everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communication to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine. And I believe that freedom must always win.
Freedom must always win. Take our country, Goldman Sachs. Take it, Raytheon. Give us all of those doubt. You know, this is, I think, what makes Zelensky such an enigma for the West. He is so subservient. He wants to sell the country. He wants the United States' monopolies, the Western finance. He wants them to dominate Ukraine, but he's still going to say things like, give me thousands of tanks, with that just absolutely cringe voice. He just wants more and more and more. Give me more weapons. This was right before it was announced that they would get more weapons, but now they're looking into Abrams. They need more, right? So it's a big business opportunity, he's saying. The military contractors will make a killing, and they have already with this. I mean, they've gotten more than $100+ billion worth of contracts from the federal government. So yes, they've made a killing off of this. And not just that, but also selling the weapons as well. So they made a killing off of this war. And of course, he has to bring in JP Morgan, BlackRock, right? Because the entire financial economic empire of the United States' military apparatus, the entirety of the system, is what Zelensky is trying to say will be so will benefit so much from further basically supplying his government with everything that it needs. So this is just the definition of what a puppet, a neo-colonial puppet, looks like. But the problem is that what Ukraine has demonstrated is that it is not a responsible party. This often happens with neo-colonies. This often happens with puppet regimes for the empire because they're politically unstable. They're not popular. They're installed, or they're propped up after an election, right? A fraudulent election, or even if it's not a fraudulent election, they're propped up not by the people, but by the forces of empire. So they're not very popular. They eventually lose their luster, and eventually they run into crises of legitimacy, which then leads to political change or possible political change. And one of the things that is going to happen soon, and has already been in the process of happening, and here what I'm going to talk about, is that the United States always had a plan to further cement its dominance in Ukraine, not just as a proxy against Russia, but also as a chip in the larger scheme of empire. It was always supposed to be a country that was just going to be looted and plundered and to the benefit of the West. The problem with Zelensky's regime is that the war has shown that it is not a reliable partner, that it is not very good at what it does, that this war is not going favorably, and that it doesn't really use the resources that it's given efficiently. What do I mean by that? Well, look at what's happened to the weapons. The weapons have been blown through. That's a lot of money blown through. And while it may be short-term profits, it's something that necessarily can't be repeated over and over and over again. It's like the metaphor of a child, right? You are feeding your infant or toddler child. You're feeding that child, and the child keeps on basically spilling its food, right? That's what the war is, right? It's just the Ukraine is not prepared to fight a war against Russia, so it just keeps on spilling its food. It wastes its food. It wastes all that it needs to be nourished, right? It's getting these weapons to be nourished in a war, and it wastes them. And so that brings concerns for larger macroeconomic policy, right? And so here you have the IMF weighing a huge package worth up to $16 billion, but there are conditions to this. And there's always conditions with the IMF. Of course, the big one always is privatization. So, of course, that's already been happening in Ukraine. They've been privatizing everything since the coup, really. And they've been getting billions to do so from the IMF. But there's a new package coming their way, a multi-year aid package, in order to help the country's need and provide a catalyst as Kiev tries to repel Russian forces, blah, blah, blah. It hinges on a number of conditions, including an endorsement from the group of 7 nations, Ukraine's donors and creditors, ensuring the stability of the country's debt. That usually just means privatize more once you get this because you can't pay off the debt. So we're going to need to take something from you in the process. So it would require changes to IMF lending rules because usually they can't fund a war-torn country, and the government would need to commit to a series of policies on top of completing a 4-month non-cash IMF program approved last year, according to the people who asked not to be identified. So they can't be identified because if they talk about it, that's really bad. So if approved, it will be a 3 to 4 year program worth 14 to 16 billion, and will assume 5 to 7 billion disbursement in the first year. And the plan is by the end of March that it would come in by April. In the best case scenario, it would be agreed on by the end of March, come in by April. And so anyway, they have to change their terms. But one of the things, though, that they're looking for, all right, is so if it doesn't get support from enough IMF countries, the fund could back Ukraine with 1.3 billion in what they call rapid financing instrument program. So last month, the IMF estimated, though, that the needs were actually so high. They were external funding needs at least to be $40 billion this year, and that it would probably account for 42 billion in the next year. So it will need likely 8 billion for critical infrastructure. And so they need a lot, basically. And the EU has committed some. And one of the things, though, that they are looking at is political, right? It's political stability. So the IMF often has this problem. The IMF often has this problem that it's trying to essentially take from neo-colonies all of their resources, privatize them, and basically make them servants of U.S. and Western capital. But it also needs to ensure that the funds that it does give, that even if it has conditions, that they're used correctly, because it just doesn't want to give money, even if U.S. corporations, Western corporations are making money. They still don't want to give money without some assurances. One of those is political stability. And I think that that can also explain why there's so many purges in Ukraine's government. It's not in the position right now in wartime to administer anything efficiently, because we've seen through the war that there are divisions in that government, and that even when there are not divisions, there's a lot of ineffectiveness. And that is what I think is going on at the heart of this, is that the CIA often comes in at the behest of the IMF. The CIA is often representing the interests of international finance. And it was likely said that, hey, you've got aid coming your way. You've got all of this investment that we're doing. Yeah, sure, it's investment that's going to basically make your people suffer, but that's always been the point. So if we're going to invest this money anyway, you have to ensure that you have political stability, that you can be trusted. And guess what? In this war, you haven't been trustworthy. It's not that you're not doing what we want necessarily. It's just you don't do it well.